Today we are going to talk about prediction markets. That was our plan, right?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure how much time we can fill with prediction markets. I feel like we can cover everything there is to know about prediction markets in about 20 minutes.
Or 10 seconds. Basically, you bet on stuff. The end.
Don't get emotional.
Or do, or Craig will take your money. So there were a few other things. I know one of the things you wanted to talk about was how do I secure my bitcoins, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think now that a lot of people have enough money of Bitcoin that they would rather not lose it, that people are thinking about this more. And certainly attackers are thinking more about how they can take your Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's true. So what was your question to me?
Blake, how do I secure my Bitcoin? It's on Coinbase right now. And you seem fine with Coinbase.
Yeah, it seems fine. So if I can elaborate, I think really your question was more like I have my bitcoins on Coinbase. Should I listen to the advice of this random guy on a forum somewhere and take them all out and put them in something else? And I think a lot of people have that question. I see a lot of people talking about that on mailing lists at work. To me, it sort of sounds like I bought a couple of ounces of gold and I have them all in a vault somewhere, but should I take them out of the vault and keep them in my house somewhere? And it doesn't seem like a very good idea. It's like, well, what do you really gain? It's like, well, then I know where it is, you know?
I think another factor here that you may not realize is that a lot of people for who the security issue is a much bigger problem are screwing around day trading. And so they're moving their Bitcoins and their other stupid cryptocurrencies between all kinds of different exchanges in order to try to, arbitrate prices between exchanges and to trade back and forth. All this stupid crap that day traders do. Where I'm just holding mine. I don't plan to ever sell them until I'm selling them for good, for cash, to then buy like dividend ETF funds for income.
Yeah.
So I feel like my security problem is quite a bit different and it's less severe. So I guess one thing to explain, do we actually have any listeners who don't know what Bitcoin is?
Yes. One.
Okay,
There's one guy.
there's one guy. Okay, so the problem is, let's say you have a brokerage account that you have some stocks in, and something gets screwed up. Not your error really, but something gets screwed up or someone attacks the account or something. They can fix that. Like they can go back and undo it and get your assets back. And it's no big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But with cryptocurrencies and especially Bitcoin, it's 100% unforgiving. And so if somebody scams you or somebody gives you some malware that steals your keys, or I've read some other attacks, and the complexity and the number of attacks are increasing, but if they do something like this and they steal your bitcoins, they're just gone. There's nobody who can bring them back.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's not like a government who has a regulating agency that tells your stock brokerage, hey, you need to be ready for this and you need to have plans for how to make it right for your customers. This is like the Wild West, and there's simply nothing that can undo this if they get stolen. So it's a much different security concern than we're used to.
That's true. Yeah. Your reasoning about how do I deal with bank accounts and how do I deal with brokerage accounts and stuff like that won't apply here. That's true. But that's also why I draw the parallel to gold, because it is more like just keeping a pile of gold in your house. And it's like, well, what if someone breaks in and takes it? What am I going to do? And it's like, yeah, you could file a police report, be on the lookout for a pound of stolen gold, but there's not really a lot you can do about it. And gold's fungible, it could be melted down. Like, you're never going to get it back. And it's kind of a similar situation with Bitcoin. Someone can just like cause your gold to get mailed to themselves and then it's gone forever. Like, it's kind of more stealable than gold.
Yeah, and again, to extend the other analogy, it's like I have gold in a vault somewhere and I'm fine keeping it there for a long time, but a guy who has gold in his house and he screws around like selling gold to pawn shops and then like buying coins that they have and other precious metals and like thinks he's going to make some money and stuff. That's a much bigger security concern, and he really does need to have that physical gold in his house to do that and engage in those activities. So I don't know if you really want to speak to those security issues, because I don't think they really affect either of us unless you have some quick, interesting things to say. But for the particular case of you and me, where we're not moving it around, we just have it in cold storage on Coinbase, or Coinbase's cold storage, which is not the same meaning as all cold storage for cryptocurrency, but is it good enough there for us?
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to start getting into a bunch of implementation details of Coinbase here. So, first off, Coinbase has cold storage and they have hot storage. They keep about 98% of their funds offline in cold storage, and those are essentially protected by the security of people not being able to find pieces of paper that are in safe deposit boxes. So, they've essentially written down their private keys and put them on QR codes and split them into a bunch of fragments, and then put them in safe deposit boxes. And I don't know, maybe they did some other secret things with them, but they have a picture of themselves putting them in a safe deposit box. And if someone could obtain those keys or coerce them into getting the keys, then they could take like 98% of Coinbase's Bitcoins. And then all their customers would irrevocably lose them. That'd be it. I'm sure they'd be very sorry, but it wouldn't help you. The other like 2% of their funds are in their hot wallet, and that's the wallet that actually transacts on a daily basis. And that's what lets Coinbase customers move money between each other and to other exchanges and on the blockchain itself. And it must have however many millions or billions of dollars in it or whatever. So I think it suffices for their everyday needs. And that wallet is insured. And I guess it's insured 100%. I believe they say that it is, but you'll notice that's like the vanishingly small proportion of the total holdings that they have. And I don't know which of my money is like, is it in the hot or the cold wallet? I don't really know. So in effect, your money may be 100% uninsured. I think that's the likeliest case. That's specifically what would happen like if your stuff gets stolen somehow, or if Coinbase gets hacked hard enough.
You've confused me a little bit here. So when you take money, let's say you either take cash and you give it to Coinbase and you buy Bitcoin, or you transfer Bitcoin to Coinbase, an account that you have there. That money, that Bitcoin rather, just all goes into Coinbase's Bitcoin account on the ledger.
Yes.
On the blockchain, I mean.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not really differentiated when you say that my Bitcoins, I don't know if they're insured or not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't have specific Bitcoins. At some point, you gave money to Coinbase, and presumably they went and bought some Bitcoins.
That's correct.
So yours should kind of be 98% uninsured and cold storage offline, or the keys are offline.
Yeah.
And 2% insured, right?
Yeah, that's probably a better way of thinking about it. Yeah, I guess what you can instead think of is like, what are the categories of attack? And one of them is Coinbase gets hacked, they lose their hot wallet. One of them is Coinbase gets hacked, they lose their cold wallet. And then I guess there's the worst possible outcome, which is they lose both. And so I guess in the case where they lose their cold wallet, all the customers would lose 98% of funds. That would probably make the most sense.
Okay. So when I get on Coinbase on my account, I have my Bitcoins in something called cold storage. Now, is that different from a cold wallet, or is that just a bookkeeping thing that Coinbase does? If I transfer Bitcoin to my cold storage wallet on Coinbase, are they actually at some point in the next couple of days making a physical transcription of a key that represents that and other people's Bitcoins and putting it into the physical world and hiding it?
I don't know. I should check that. I don't think they put it in the physical world. So if they were moving it, they would just put it in the cold wallet. They wouldn't have to do any additional real world stuff. They like have two wallets, and they can just set any wallet as the receiver for funds. So
Okay, right, because the blockchain will acknowledge that that wallet received those funds.
Yeah.
And then in order for them to ever take money out of that wallet on the blockchain, they need that key that they've written down in the physical world.
Yeah.
and presumably taken off of all computers so that it can't be compromised electronically.
Yeah. So I think when you send them money, you send it to their hot wallet. And probably if their hot wallet ever has too many funds, they put the overage in the cold wallet over time because the procedure to pull it back out of the cold wallet is crappy. And so they don't want to have to do that. But people have hypothesized that sometimes, like Coinbase has gone down a few times, and they've hypothesized that it's because they had to like do the pull coins out of cold wallet procedure because people were just on a buying frenzy recently. And so they're thinking they took it down for a couple hours and then actually ran out to these banks and did whatever their protocol was for pulling more funds out. And I think that you could deduce if this happened. I think you can figure out which addresses on the blockchain are theirs because like you give them funds and it'll go to their hot wallet. And if a huge amount of money has moved from a giant wallet into their hot wallet, probably that's their cold wallet. So like these should be findable. I just don't know that people have tried to find them because it's like, what are you going to do once you found it? But presumably you could see. So the other thing is you mentioned having your cold storage on Coinbase. I think that's called the vault. I think
Right.
that's their term for it.
Yeah, I may be remembering the wrong term, but it's a different level of storage where basically you will tell Coinbase I would like to remove this amount of Bitcoin from the vault, and then it emails two separate email accounts that you control for verification, and then it also takes 48 hours to process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that's just like an authentication delay that they add on their end. It's for people who are worried. And so like I would advocate that anybody who's not regularly moving funds turn that on because then it's just much harder for someone to like hack your computer and then steal all of your stuff. So the alternative that those random forum people were talking about was essentially creating a private key that only you know, transferring all your Bitcoin to that, and then keeping track of your private key yourself.
Right.
Right.
And then there were several suggestions, like you use the what's it, Ledger Nano S, you can do that. And then some of them were trying to show how hardcore they were, and they were like, buy a sheet of steel from Amazon and a set of punches and literally punch out your key on the sheet of steel and then keep the sheet of steel at your house.
But then what if someone steals it and they recognize that that's a key?
I mean, hide it up in your attic under some insulation or something.
And then your house burns down, and then the firefighters show up and they fight the fire, and then they're searching through all the wreckage, and some guy's like, "Is this a Bitcoin private key?" And then they take all your money.
I think that's pretty unlikely. So let me ask you a question. Do you think that scenario is more or less likely than Coinbase losing their cold wallet?
Well, that specific scenario is less likely, but the scenario where you are unable to retrieve your own coins or move them, I think is probably more likely. So that's the real problem of trying to secure your own Bitcoins yourself. You have to write this private key down, and then no one can ever look at it ever until you need to look at it. And that's a really difficult security problem that most of us are not prepared to reason about. We know how to reason about like physical tokens, like I have this token, you don't have it, I can move it around, things like that. But it's something where no one can know the information that's on it. And if they know the information, they could just like copy it. And then it doesn't even matter where the token is. Like that's much harder. It was actually a big problem because people were trying to make physical manifestations of Bitcoins for a while. They wanted to be like, look, this is a Bitcoin. And there's not really a good way to do it because you end up having to write a private key on it somewhere. And then someone can take a photo of it and be like, look, here's my Bitcoin. You can buy it for, $5 on eBay. Here's a picture of it. And then it'd be like, oh, all your coins are stolen because someone could just look at the picture and extract the private key.
Right. And so anything you do that tries to give you some redundancy in not losing your key also compromises your security more. So
Yeah.
if we go back to the example of, using a set of punches to pound the key out into a plate of steel, you could make multiple plates in case your house burns down, but then you have multiple chances to lose them in different places that you hide them. Or you have multiple chances for one of them to just be destroyed and unrecoverable.
Yeah.
And maybe you'll be smart and you'll think, I'll split the key between 4 different plates and hide them in 4 different places in 4 different ways. And then if any one of them becomes unrecoverable, you've lost all the Bitcoin.
Yeah. And there's a thing called Shamir secret sharing that you can use to take private keys and convert them into something where you need M of N keys to reconstruct it. So you can make something where you have 5 different manifestations of this key and you need any 3 of them. So you don't have to just like split it into thirds. It's just like you need any 3, like voting. But then now you have to come up with like a whole protocol. So you're like, all right, I'm going to do this 3 of 5 thing, and then I'm going to split it with all my family members. But then maybe you don't want to pull your Bitcoin back out for 10 years. And so then you go back to your parents' house and you're like, hey, where's that steel plate that I gave you guys 10 years ago? And they're like, oh, I don't know. We've moved twice since then. We threw away a bunch of crap. I don't know where it is. And you're like, okay. And then you go try to find the one that you buried and you can't remember where you buried it. And then also your house burned down and the firefighter stole one of them. And you just run into this problem where it's like, how durable can I make an object for this length of time? Can I put it somewhere, make sure that nothing happens to it, make sure I can get to it later,
and make sure that the information is not degraded?
Yeah.
Because if you lose one bit of information, then it's worthless.
Well, no, then you would just make both guesses.
Okay, I see what you mean.
You're like, I have 255 binary digits, but I don't have the last one. And then there's a whole action movie plot around trying to find the 1 or 0. Why don't you just guess both? And then Tom Cruise is like, damn it.
But you know what I mean from that example.
Yeah.
If part of the plate becomes so rusted and destroyed that you can't read many digits, then it's useless. Mm-hmm. You may be left guessing millions and not 2.
Yeah. Although it'd still be worth it. It has to be a lot of the plate. But yeah, so then the other problem is, all right, so you've done this entire protocol. You've split your keys into a million shards. You've left them with all these people. You have your 3-ring binder that has the protocol for how to resurrect the key. You've shared that with a bunch of people. And so then 10 years later, you're like, all right, it's time to bring my key back. So you reconstruct it in your underground layer with your laptop that's off the internet. And now you have to construct a transaction to move it to wherever you want to. And you have to not screw it up. And it's really important that you don't screw it up. Like you're saying, send the Bitcoins from here to here and send the change to this address. And like, if you switch the change in the destination, or if you switch the fee, then like you've messed it up. Like people have accidentally done transactions where they've flipped the fee and how much they're trying to send. And so they accidentally gave like a 10 Bitcoin reward to whoever mined the next block. And the miners will gladly take your money. They're like, I don't know why you did that, but whatever. And you can do something like that. And so I feel like, at least personally, I think there's so many ways I could mess up this key sharing thing. There's so many ways I could mess up trying to reconstruct it afterwards. Also, the keys themselves could get messed up, or someone else that I hand part of it to could mess it up. And then once I've reconstructed it, I could still mess up the resulting transaction. And I think if you're honest with yourself and you think, what are my error rates for doing something like this that I've literally never done before? It's not good enough compared to how likely do I think Coinbase is to get hacked. And it's easy to imagine like, oh, Coinbase, they're just a company. They're a big target. They're not a government. There is a real chance that they get hacked. But I think that the chance that you screw something up with your own coins is higher. And so that's why I don't really advocate that people do that unless they have some kind of special need. And with Coinbase, you trust Coinbase, the org, to not take your coins. Like they can say, oh, your account's suspicious. We flagged it, which is essentially they seized all your stuff. Any employee at Coinbase or a group of employees who has enough access could steal your coins. Anyone who can hack Coinbase can steal your coins. And any government that can coerce Coinbase, which is mainly the US government, could also like steal or freeze your coins. So you do have to deal with all those entities. But if you take them out yourself, you have to deal with like the natural environment and your own failings. And I think that it's really similar to if you have however many thousands of dollars or whatever, do I leave it with a bank or do I keep it in cash at my house? And at a certain point, you start saying, I'm not as good at keeping track of all this money as a bank is probably going to be. And Coinbase isn't quite a bank. It doesn't have FDIC insurance, and they don't have years of history of dealing with this stuff. But I still think that it's more like leaving it with a bank. So what are you going to do?
I'm just going to leave it at Coinbase because, like I said, I'm not transferring it to a bunch of exchanges already, which I think is where a lot of those attacks that I sent you that link about happen.
Mm-hmm.
One particular attack where you put a destination address in, and then you've pasted it from your clipboard, and it just substitutes a malicious address in its place when you paste it. There's malware running on your computer that says this looks like a Bitcoin address. I'm just going to replace it with my own malicious one so that the bad guys receive your Bitcoin. So if you just paste it and hit send without looking at what the address is and verifying it, then you've just sent it off to some malicious player.
Yeah, I thought that was a really clever sounding malware when I first read that, and then I thought, if you have malware that can insert itself into the user's clipboard when they're in a web browser and do stuff, why don't you just make it navigate the web browser to the exchange and do the transaction for them?
I bet it'll get there.
Well, I mean, why wouldn't you just start with that? If if I'm writing malware, that's what I would do. It would be like, let's go to Coinbase and try to log in, and then if it can, it would be like, send all the funds. Why would you screw around with this clipboard stuff?
It seems a lot more complicated to do what you're describing, but I don't know, maybe it's not. Maybe you'd be motivated to just accomplish what you're suggesting from the start because there's so much money involved.
Yeah, you basically only have to win like once, and then it's well worth it. And so I expect there to be a fair bit of malware that tries to do stuff like that. And then probably there'll be this arms race, like Coinbase will try and detect if this is a malware initiated transaction, and they'll be okay for a while, and then someone will be like, I tried to do this transaction, but Coinbase blocked me for no reason. Obviously they've been hacked and the government's in control and they're trying to steal my money. And they'll be like, no, this is our anti-fraud system. You looked like malware. And they'll be like, I'm not malware. And I'm sure this is all coming in the near future. But it sounded clever. Yeah, I think I'm gonna leave my coins with Coinbase also. So in follow up to what we talked about last time, I believe, when we talked about various drugs
Mm-hmm.
that you can take, or maybe you shouldn't take, I don't know. I realized I'd left something out. Have you heard of melatonin?
Yeah, it helps you fall asleep.
Yeah. So I found out about melatonin from gwern.net, which is Gwern. And that guy does a lot of like objective looks at drugs that I think people don't look at objectively enough. And I feel like he does a very good job of being very evidence based in areas where it's really politically controversial. Melatonin's not so much, but he like gave himself LSD microdosing to test if that worked. I'm not doing that. But melatonin it's just like some hormone that your body produces naturally, and it's essentially the hormone that's like makes you feel sleepy. And you can find it in grocery stores in the, I guess, placebo aisle is how I would describe it. Like you can get turmeric root or whatever, different things that don't do anything for you, but melatonin's sitting there like a gem in the middle of all this. And if you take a couple of melatonin, like in my case, I take about 0.9 milligrams of it, it just makes you feel sleepy after like 10 or 15 minutes. I don't know if you take it, Craig.
No, I never have.
Oh, well, I recommend it. I tell everyone about this that I can, except in the last podcast episode apparently because I forgot. But it's like life-changing. Basically, you can just take it at night before you go to bed and it'll make you feel sleepier, and then it's very easy to go to sleep. And if you work a job, being able to go to sleep, like when you say, "Okay, it's time for bed," if you can go to sleep immediately when you say it's time for bed, then you really maximize your sleep and it'll just make you a much happier person. You'll get a lot more sleep. And so I feel like I can't recommend it highly enough. It's just life changing. You start taking melatonin, and it's very easy to just get enough sleep all the time. And you can also take it when you fly on an airplane, and it's really helpful there. If you take it, it'll make you feel pretty sleepy, and a lot of times it's really difficult to sleep on an airplane, I think, for most people. But it's fairly easy if you take melatonin and use like earplugs or something like that. So if you're listening and you're curious, I really recommend that you buy some melatonin and try it and let us know how it works. I'd be interested to know if it doesn't work for anybody. Pretty much everyone I've gotten to try it is like, yes, this is amazing. I also recommend taking only like a milligram of it. A lot of things are like extra strength, super hard melatonin or whatever, 5 milligrams, take 3 capsules. But it sounds like if you take too much of it, you can get reduced effects from it, or you can sort of build up a tolerance for it. So it's important that you find the right dose, and you'll probably want to adjust it up and down and see how it makes you feel. But it's really cool. You just take it, and 15 minutes later, you're like, man, I feel really sleepy. and that is really nice. And yeah, it's life changing. You should try it.
Are there any subsequent issues with wakefulness?
No, that's the other thing that seems really nice about it that I've encountered. If you take it and then you like say do something interesting, like you read an interesting book or you sit on your computer and browse the web or whatever, after about an hour, most of the effect seems to wear off.
Wow.
So you sort of have a window where you feel sleepy and then nothing. One day I accidentally took it before I went to work, and then I was like, oops, that was stupid. And then I felt kind of sleepy driving to work, and then when I got there, it felt fine. So that's really nice too. It doesn't really have a side effect. It just makes you feel sleepy for this window of time, and then it goes away.
That's really cool. I was worried I would have to then go on to modafinil in order to wake up.
Just take them both, see which one wins. Yeah, it's really convenient in that way, and I haven't experienced any side effects from it. So can't recommend it highly enough. If you have any trouble with sleeping, take melatonin. Also, probably fix all your other problems, but still, taking melatonin is a useful thing. So, another thing I wanted to talk about that's been in the news lately is, have you heard about a swatting incident?
Yeah, I heard about that. So apparently there were some people playing Call of Duty and they got in an argument and somebody got in touch with a guy who just kind of specializes in having people swatted.
Mm-hmm.
And he confronted the person he was being, I don't know if he was getting paid to do this or what, or just asked, but he confronted the person online and then the person gave him a fake address to a guy who lives in Kansas. And so this dude who swats people then from Los Angeles, where he lives, calls this police department in Kansas and he's like, hey, there's this hostage situation at this house. A guy's barricaded with a bunch of guns and he's like, wants to commit suicide by cop and like, all this stuff. So the police head out to this address, which is just not the address of anyone involved in this situation up to this point of all the people who were on Call of Duty playing. And he's just a guy at his house in Kansas. And then the police show up and he comes to his door. There's a bunch of cops outside, a giant spotlight. And like he comes to his door and opens it and the police kill him.
From across the street.
Yes, there's lapel camera footage of it. So an officer standing next to the officer who actually killed the guy.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that they're quite a ways away across the street. The guy's like opened his front door and there's this huge spotlight shining at him. And then this other officer standing there just like shoots him with what appears to be a rifle from across the street. And the guy died on the way to the hospital, I believe.
Yeah. So what do you think about this whole incident?
I was shocked to learn that this is the first person killed in a swatting incident in the US. Because I know swatting has been going on for like, at least at the level where it gets media publicity for like 5 years now, something like that.
Yeah, that's about what I would say.
Yeah. And I was really shocked to learn. In fact, I thought it must be a mistake when I first read that this was the first person killed in a swatting incident. I read some really interesting analysis of what you may or may not be able to charge the person who made the phone call to the police in Kansas with. And I've read various opinions that he could be charged with all kinds of murder of various types, and various also well-reasoned opinions that he could probably not be charged with anything more than a misdemeanor. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out.
Yeah. And what do you think about the cop who shot the guy?
Yeah, so the lapel camera footage is pretty damning because the dude comes to his door and he opens it up. He's got this like you can see it's this really bright like searchlight aimed at his front porch. And then the cop just shoots him. And it's like, well, that's interesting. The dude's like 50 or 60 feet away. And the courts have been really bad in the last 15 or 20 years about the reasonableness of officer involved shootings. And I think as somebody who studies lethal force law, because I carry a gun every time I leave my house, and I'm very familiar with the lethal force statutes and the requirements in the state of Texas, at least, it's amazing the stuff that you see police get away with.
Like what?
Situations where you'll have a reasoning that is no stronger than there was a sudden movement and I was scared. And so they kill somebody. And that's okay.
Hmm.
And that's not the standard that people are held to if you just have a concealed carry license and you're a regular person going out to dinner and you kill someone. If your only defense is, dude, that guy at the other table over there, he just moved suddenly and I got scared, so I killed him. That's not a defense that's going to hold up for you.
Yeah. But what if cops are regularly exposed to dangerous situations? That's the argument I've heard. It's like, oh, if you're in that line of work, you're exposed to danger all the time and you have to protect yourself. And I don't know, there are things like that.
That doesn't mean the standard should be different.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel.
If you can't handle that danger, you should be in a different line of work. It's funny, I that makes me recall something I read about the F-35. There were some test pilots and they were having some, imagine this, some problems with the vehicle a few years ago. And at one point, like a bunch of test pilots kind of got together. They didn't really rebel or anything, but they were just like, look, this stuff is serious and we should stop flying for a while until some of these problems get fixed. And this general came to talk with them and he basically said, like, you're test pilots in the US Air Force. This is a dangerous job. If you can't handle the danger, go fly for FedEx.
Yeah. Did any of them go fly for FedEx?
I doubt it.
Yeah, I feel like I regularly see cops sort of get a pass on that because it's like the common defense I've seen is in like reports and stuff. They'll be like the officer fearing for his safety, reach for his gun and blah blah blah, and they make it sound like a very standard approach to dealing with stuff. But I also feel like what I consistently see is cops put themselves in a situation where they know that if anything happens, they're going to shoot the person involved. And they did, in fact, have an option as to whether or not to put themselves in the situation. But they repeatedly do it because they know that it's pretty consequence free. Like, I've seen an incident where someone has a knife and is just like yelling a lot, and some, I believe, campus officers shoot him. And they didn't need to. And I know people will make arguments about whether they needed to or not. But essentially, the cops got out of their car and walked closer and closer to the guy until he was a threat to them. And a reasonable person, like a person who's concealed carrying and knows the law and cares about the consequences, wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't get their gun out and walk closer and closer to the guy because that's a stupid thing to do. And I guess that you could argue it's the cop's job, but I don't think that they took a bunch of appropriate actions. And then at the end, they shoot the guy, and it's like, it's easy to justify, like, well, he was really close and he had a knife, but it's like, how did we get here? And I feel like I don't see the same. I mean, like you said, you don't really see the same standards, or cops held to the same standards there. And the same thing happens with swatting. Like cops will, they like, let's play army, and they get all their SWAT gear and trucks and everything, and then show up somewhere and create a situation where there's a reasonable chance that someone's going to get shot. And by doing this repeatedly, they create a reasonable chance that innocent people are going to get shot. But it's like each incident's viewed in isolation, and each time it's like, well, the officers are justified because they're afraid and they have firearms and who knows what the other person's going to do. But statistically, it's pretty much ensuring that some fraction of innocent people are going to get killed. And it makes you think like, well, then is this a reasonable procedure to be following? But the people who create the procedure and promote it and continue to implement it don't get punished. Because if you create some systemic thing that kills people, mostly, unless there's some kind of public outcry about it, nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's only when you're like specifically the person who pulled the trigger. So I don't really know what can be done about swatting or what's going to end up happening. I guess it'll just persist for a while until a few more people get killed.
I imagine what will happen is a lot of states will pass laws to add a lot of punishment to it. And they'll try to deter it that way. And then the feds may get involved because you can argue this is an interstate crime. Because in this particular case, this previous week, the guy making the call was in Los Angeles, and then the innocent guy who got killed was in Kansas. And
yeah,
there's a reasonable argument that it should be a federal issue and that federal law should control this.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first thing that will happen. We'll get a bunch of new laws against swatting, and then we'll see if that does any good. And I kind of think it'll be like a tiny bit effective, but not much.
What countermeasures do you think someone should employ if they think that they're a person who might get swatted?
You should never come to your door when the police are knocking, ever. Just in general for anything. There's never a time when like a cop randomly knocks at your door and it's beneficial for you to answer it. Like maybe you've called the police and you need to summon their help, then yeah, you should answer because you called them. But if it's just out of the blue, like suddenly there's sirens, there's flashing lights, there's a giant spotlight pointing at your front porch, and there's like a bullhorn outside and a guy yelling to come out with your hands up, you better not open your door. That's the first thing.
So then what should you do?
I just kind of generally live under the rule that I don't open my door for anyone ever, but that's just me. But especially for the police, you shouldn't open your door.
So what should you do if the police show up and they're yelling at you like this, and then you're like, well, I'm not going to open my door? Do you just wait for a while? I don't think they just go away, do they?
No, you should call 911 and talk to the operator and say, look, there's a bunch of police outside my house and I don't know why. I think there's some mistake here. And can you tell them to hold on while we get this sorted out?
Yeah. I thought about it some, and that was the conclusion I reached. Is that gives you a safe way, well, relatively safe way to talk to the police, where you're very unlikely to get shot because they can't see you to shoot you, but you can still communicate. I think the likely outcome is they're still going to come into the house. Like a bunch of people are going to come in the house with guns drawn, and they're going to point them at everybody, but you're less likely to get shot.
Yeah.
This is not legal advice, and we're not lawyers. I don't really know what else you could do, though. Maybe you could hop in your armored personnel carrier and just drive away.
If you did have an up-armored executive luxury SUV, that would be a choice.
I'm going out for milk. Take a couple of shots at your car. It would be an unusual exchange, to say the least. Have you ever seen this incident where, I can't remember what country it was in. I believe it was like Sweden. But there was this group of people who were running a data center that was in a nuclear missile silo, or a former nuclear missile silo. Maybe it wasn't Sweden. I can't remember what country it was. But then the cops showed up. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it was great. So they're in, I believe it was a nuclear missile silo. And it basically has a vault door, like a bank. And then the people are much farther in because there's like a tunnel, and then they're way in there with their offices and their computers and stuff. And so apparently someone tried to SWAT them, I believe. And the police showed up and they threw a flashbang at the door, and it was just like, bam. And then the people inside in the data center only found out later that this even happened because the police called and were like, we attempted to break in, but it didn't work. And then they reviewed the security footage, and then they saw these cops standing outside like, what do we do? I thought that was really funny. I've always thought it would be really cool if you could have your house armored up to such a point where the cops come and they like try to break in, and then you're like, you're gonna have to ask permission. Because most houses are essentially made of paper compared to the cops willing to like bash on them with a battering ram or whatever it is.
You wouldn't even need to get to that point. I mean, if you just had something less than that, it might buy you enough time. But I don't know, you also run into the problem where the police do like a no-knock warrant, and so then there's no opportunity for you to get on the phone with 911 and try to defuse the situation. You just suddenly have a whole bunch of people battering down your door and running in.
Yeah.
And that's been an issue in the US for a while, where no-knock warrants are served on the wrong house and innocent people end up getting killed.
Yeah.
There have even been cases where no-knock warrants get served on the wrong house. An innocent homeowner shoots and kills a cop and then is put on trial for murder. And then there have further been cases where all of that happens and the innocent homeowner is actually found not guilty.
Oh, have they ever been found guilty for it?
Yeah.
Oh. How does that work exactly?
Yeah, I can't understand it. Like a prosecutor who's like, the police broke into a guy's house, a guy who is not a criminal, not expecting to have his door busted down by the cops. And then he shot a cop in self-defense. And it's like, we should put him on trial for murder. I've never really understood that reasoning.
Well, I can see a prosecutor putting them on trial. That's their job. But it's hard to imagine them winning. But I guess it's happened.
I think a lot of people are not familiar enough with jury nullification, and they just go into the juror's box with the instructions from the judge, and they act like robots, and then they deliver the verdict.
So for our listeners, what is jury nullification?
Jury nullification is the sacred right of a juror to rule that the law is wrong and immoral, and that you will not enforce it. Even if a person being charged is guilty, you will not rule them guilty as a juror. This typically applies, at least if you want to be moral about it, this applies only in malum prohibitum instances, meaning that a law is a law simply because some legislators decided that this should be wrong, as opposed to the other type, which is malum in se, which means that it's wrong in and of itself, like murder or rape or property crimes, things like that. So a malum prohibitum crime would be like possession of marijuana. It's like there's no victim there. And so that's the kind of case where, yeah, you could make an argument that it's moral to practice jury nullification, even if the defendant is in fact guilty of having marijuana, and under all definitions of the law in your state, they're guilty. You're going to say he's not guilty and I'm not convicting him. And so a lot of people, like, as a legal concept, it's fairly controversial in the US. I think there's one state where the standard juror instructions actually include not the words jury nullification, but a vague kind of description that, yes, you are judging the morality of the law as well as the act of the defendant.
Mm-hmm.
But in most states, simply mentioning jury nullification means you won't be put on a jury, and if you're on a jury, you'll get kicked off and replaced with an alternate. And so it's essentially a violation of your rights to be told that jury nullification is not an option. Obviously, in America, the jury verdict is the verdict. It can't be changed. I know in places like Australia, a jury can render a verdict, and then the judge can unilaterally decide to overrule it. And so in America, that's not the case. And so if the jury comes back and says not guilty for this crime that the person obviously committed, there's no one that can undo that.
Mm-hmm.
So you do have the right to jury nullification. What I mean by that is there's no practical way to ever stop it.
You'd have to make the system work in a different way.
Yeah. If you were to argue that you don't have the right to jury nullification, well, then the jury would only have the purpose of objectively evaluating the events of the case and rendering a verdict according to the law, if jury nullification is not your right. In that case, you don't even need a jury. Every trial could just be a bench trial, and the decision could be handed down by a judge who could just objectively look at the arguments from the two sides and examine the text of the law and say objectively whether or not the person violated it.
Yeah.
So the very fact that we have juries means that jury nullification is your right.
I guess you could have judge nullification. There's some term for that too. I think that phrase is usually legislating from the bench.
Yeah, I think that's more in the appeals process. It's not in initial criminal trials or lawsuits or things like that. It's during the appeals.
So if you're ever in a jury selection process, usually the phrase the lawyers will use is something like, would you ever use anything from outside the law to render a verdict? Or something like that.
Yeah, and they're obviously hoping that you say yes, and then they'll be like, we don't want you.
Yeah. Well, they're probably hoping that you say no so that they can pick you and get on with the day. Probably the ideal case for lawyers is the first 12 people they interview are all good candidates, and then they're done.
Yeah, I guess so. Or not good, but acceptable.
Easily convinced. I've been in jury selection panels, and that seems to be the thing that they're selecting for. They're like, do you agree with the last guy who talked to you? And you're like, yeah. And they're like, all right, you sound good. And it sounds like that's what both of, like, the prosecuting and defending attorneys were both looking for that. I didn't get called to serve on the jury, though.
I remember you telling me that story.
Mm-hmm.
It was something about, like, They asked you some question about drugs, and you gave this funny answer about prohibition.
Yeah. So the guy, just from what they had said, I'm pretty sure that the guy was caught by the cops with a lot of meth in his car somewhere that they were able to discover on searching it. It was like hidden under a body panel or something like that. And I think he was the only person driving it. So, like, obviously he had it. And it sounds like possession crimes care a lot about this, like, care, custody, and control concept. And then they explain what each of these things are. And it's basically like, did you really have it or was it just around you? And so the whole prosecution was going to focus on like whether it's his or not. And so it's definitely in the realm where juries could nullify this because they could be like, I don't think it was his. And what are you going to do?
That hold on, that's different. That means that the jury is simply not convinced. Nullification would be that the prosecution established that it was his meth and that he was transporting it, and then the jury says, "Screw that. That law is immoral. You should be allowed to have meth."
Yeah.
We're not. We're gonna say not guilty.
Okay, I guess that's a good point. It's kind of material though. But then they got around to me and they were like, okay, so what do you think? And I can't remember what the question was, but I was like, I think that the war on drugs is essentially like prohibition, and it's extremely harmful to everyone in the US, and eventually it's going to be repealed and drugs will be legal. And so I don't think it's really very helpful to enforce those laws. And they're like, okay, you can go. And then the next guy was like, I agree with juror 23. And they're like, you can go also. It was great though. I didn't want to serve on that jury. I should have seen what happened to that guy though. But I know some people who are aware of all these things and then they try really hard to serve on a jury. They're like, oh yeah, I'm easily convinced. Yeah, whatever you just said, lawyer. Totally. I don't know. Are you a person who would want to serve on a jury or avoid it?
No, I think it's important that people take it seriously when they're called for jury duty.
That's not what I asked.
Yes, I would. I would have no problem. I've actually never been called.
Wow.
Yeah.
I get summons all the time. I think I've gotten like 4 in my life, which seems like kind of a lot.
I think I've advocated for jury nullification on the internet way too much, and I'm on some secret list, so I'm never going to get called, especially not after this podcast with my real name attached to it.
Secret list. I guess it would be incumbent on a prosecuting attorney to check for it, huh?
Yeah.
A defense attorney would want to know about this, and then I don't know. Are they obligated to say anything if they know that a juror is an advocate of jury nullification? Probably not. So, if you're ever on a jury selection panel and prosecuting attorney is like, Craig, what do you think about drugs? And you're like, oh, I don't know, whatever you just said. And then the defense attorney's like, no questions. Then you'll know. You'll know that he's in the secret cabal and he found out that you care about jury nullification.
There was a case several years ago where there was this old retired guy, and he would just hang out outside of the courthouse and pass out literature on jury nullification, hoping to catch people coming in for jury duty and give it to them. And so he was on public property outside the courthouse, and eventually, like, the bailiff arrested him for passing out the literature, and he was charged with jury tampering. And it was a very tenuous charge because it's like, well, he was handing out literature to everyone. He was not like asking, are you here for jury duty, and then doing it. And then also, these people were not on a jury yet. They were there as potential jurors.
Some of them could have been on jury, right? If they're walking in on their second day.
Yeah, but even then, if he didn't know, I mean, if he didn't query them and say, are you on a jury?
Yeah.
I would like to speak with you.
Yeah.
You know, and so it was a very, very like squishy kind of charge. It was like, how is that gonna say? And so then the guy's like, oh goody, let's go to a jury trial for this.
I didn't even think about that.
And then suddenly the prosecutor said, oh shit, that's right. It'll be a jury trial of a guy who's like passing out jury nullification information. And they're like, we can't have this. Let's plead him down to something like, a fine where we don't have to put him in front of a jury. And the guy kept refusing and they dropped the charges.
There really is no way out of that one, is there?
It's pretty tough.
He was passing He's passing out literature that said something. They'd be like, "What does it say?" And they'd be like, "Oh, it's not entered into evidence, and you're not allowed to go look up what it was."
It's super
And then
important. It is why we're charging him, but you can't know.
trust us, it was very tamperful. Oh man, I bet that guy was really pleased at that outcome. I remember hearing a little about that case, but I didn't know that he pushed for a jury trial, which totally makes sense. And then he must have gotten an inordinate amount of press for the concept of jury
Right.
nullification.
Right.
Yeah. Wow, he really won that day.
Yeah. So, for anyone interested in learning more, you can go visit the website of the Fully Informed Jury Association, which is a nonprofit group that publishes literature about jury nullification.
It's weird that guy cared about that so much. But anyway. Okay. So you want to actually talk about prediction markets?
Yeah, I guess Dimitri's like sitting here and he's like, these fuckers. The title of this was Cryptocurrency Security and Prediction Markets. And now we're 56 minutes in and they're just now talking about this.
Maybe we could just get to it next episode.
Yeah, we could push it another week. You know, I really want to do firearms ballistic science. So we could push it to after that.
Sorry, Dimitri. Yeah. So we've gotten requests from more than one person, actually, basically along the lines of what are prediction markets. And in our last episode, we actually danced all around the concept. But the simple way of putting it is a prediction market lets you bet on the outcome of an event. And typically the events are not dog races. However, a dog race is an example of a prediction market. But usually you're trying to do something else. Like a really common application is predict who the next US president is going to be in the lead up to an election. And so the typical way a prediction market is implemented is it'll sell contracts for like $1 or $10. Usually there's some integral amount of money, so they're easy to reason about. And the contract will be something like Trump wins the 2016 presidential election. And if he does, it pays out $1. And if he doesn't, it pays out $0.
For each share that you've bought.
Yeah. And so what people can do is trade these shares between each other at whatever price they agree on.
Yeah, I think one detail that people may be confused on here, the shares have to come into existence somehow, and the way that happens is that a person and then a counterparty will make opposite bets at the same time to create these shares. So think of them more like options contracts and the way those come into existence. You have someone who buys the contract at the same time that someone writes it.
You're going to have to explain an options contract now.
Well, shit.
Not everyone's familiar with options contracts.
What I mean is that the number of shares in a prediction market that are in existence is not constant.
Yes.
Where in a stock market, the number of shares of a company that exist is kind of constant. You know, for today, we can say it's constant. But the number of options contracts floating around that are written against a company is non-constant. It can change all the time.
Yeah.
And so in a prediction market, the number of shares is non-constant.
Yeah.
And that's important because people may wonder, where do these shares come from? How are they created at the start? Do we mine them?
They come from thin air. Yeah. So yeah, an easy way to put it would be something like it's in the lead up to the election and someone's like, I still think it's too close to call. And so they're like, I will pay 50 cents for a contract that pays out $1 if Trump wins. And someone else is like, sure, I think that he is more likely to win than 50%. So it's a good idea for me to sell that contract to you. And so they will create the contract out of thin air. And that's the party and the counterparty, and they'll agree on it. So that gets into the next part, which is since this contract pays out 1 if the event happens and 0 if it doesn't, the price should reflect what percentage chance the parties believe this event has of occurring. So if if the contract's currently priced at 50 cents and it pays out $1, and you think this event has a 90% chance of occurring, from your perspective, this contract is worth 90 cents because 90% chance of happening times $1 if it pays out means it has a 90-cent value. And so you should go in and buy up all the contracts that you can find that cost less than 90 cents, any that anyone is offering, and also create new ones if anyone will counterparty you. And if you believe the event isn't going to occur, it's unlikely, and it occurs 10% of the time, then similarly, you value all the contracts at 10 cents. And so if anyone's offering to buy them for less money than that, you should accept that trade. But also, if you currently possess any and anyone's willing to buy them from you for more than 10 cents, you should sell them all because you're like, suckers, you think it's worth 50 cents. I think it's worth 10. So of course you should sell it and get out.
Or you should short sell them.
Yeah. A lot of times the way that takes place on a prediction market, though, is you just buy the other contract.
Right. So, for instance, there would be a question of who is going to win the 2016 presidential election, and you can either buy a Donald Trump contract or a Hillary Clinton contract.
Yeah. And so that would be well, actually, is that a binary option market? I guess it has two options.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then a problem will occur sometimes where the two prices of these contracts don't sum up to exactly $1. And that's a problem with a lot of prediction markets right now. And that indicates that usually there's a lack of liquidity in the market. Because, like, if Hillary shares are trading at 50 cents and Trump shares are trading at 60 cents or 40 cents, then obviously there's an imbalance in the market because they should both be trading at one minus each other's price. But sometimes there's not enough money in the system, or there's not enough ability for people to move money around, or the fees are too high or something like that. And so you can look at this arbitrage opportunity and wish you could exploit it, but you can't. And that's a big problem with modern prediction markets because they're not popular enough. And so there isn't enough money in it, and it's not easy enough to move money around. And so when people are like, why aren't prediction markets more accurate? That's one of the reasons.
Mm-hmm. So there's some other interesting problems that happen, and that actually happened with the 2016 presidential election in prediction markets. You have to understand that when a prediction market says that event A is, a share of event A costs 70 cents and a share of event B costs 30 cents, and events A and B are mutually exclusive, it doesn't mean that A is going to happen just because it's trading at 70 cents. And even if it's trading at 99 cents, it doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It means there's a 70% or a 99% or whatever chance of it happening. And specifically that problem happened with prediction markets for the 2016 presidential election, but it also happens more frequently. It's almost like prediction markets are kind of breaking down because people are learning, oh, I can go look at a prediction market to see what people willing to invest money are thinking will happen. That's this especially potent way of predicting the future.
Well, it is.
Yeah, you can argue it is or it isn't. We'll come to that. But and then they look at these odds, and that if they see an imbalance in the odds, then they basically commit this fallacy where they then say, oh, it's certain. The prediction market has deigned that this will happen.
The markets have spoken.
Yes. And the reality is, it's like the chance of rain tomorrow is 60%. Well, okay, 4 out of 10 days that are like today, followed by a day like tomorrow, will not have rain.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean the weatherman's an idiot. It just means that there was also a 40% chance of it not happening. And so it's kind of a human fallacy that's placed on top of prediction markets. It's that the prediction market is predicting the future. No, it's predicting the odds of things happening in the future.
Yeah.
And so then you get this second order problem on top of that. It's that people say, oh, there's a 70% chance of it raining. Well, I'm going all in on it raining because the market has already determined that it's going to rain tomorrow. And so then they buy up all the shares of rain that they can find on the market for sale at any price because they think they're all guaranteed to pay out $1.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the prediction market starts to feed back on itself and become inaccurate.
Although that's okay. That's a self-correcting problem.
It's self-correcting only if people who can identify that problem come in and have the money to start exploiting it.
Yeah, but also they eventually will. In general, when there's an exploitable opportunity like that, people will seek to exploit it. Or if they're unable, then it is in fact not an exploitable opportunity like you thought.
Yeah, I think we could get into some specific academic requirements for applying the efficient market hypothesis, but
Yes.
it comes back down to, is there enough liquidity in the market?
Yeah. The feedback cycle reminds me of this graph I saw a while ago. I think it was during like the Katrina hurricane season, but it showed how accurate people were getting at forecasting. I think specifically where the center of the hurricane's eye was going to make landfall. And it showed that over time the error was going down, and it was going down, well, I guess you could think of it as exponentially or logarithmically. And so they plotted it on a log chart, and they showed that the prediction error was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And sometime in, it was like 2030 or 2040, it was going to cross, and the predictions were actually going to be more accurate than the hurricanes were. it was really, it was really just an instructive example to show sort of the dangers of extrapolating.
Yeah. So I remember another example exactly like that I saw on a PBS kids show when I was a little kid. And they were like doing this little mock interview of a guy. It was one of these like math shows on PBS, you know.
Was it Square One?
Could have been. I would have to go look up on YouTube and watch some episodes to see which ones. But they had this guy, and it's, you know, this kind of set up like this late night interview kind of thing. And this guy's like, yeah, I've done all this research on beating the world record for running a mile. And he's like, here's a chart of how the world record mile time has come down over the years. And then he had extrapolated on the chart below zero to where people would finish running the mile before they started. And he's like, by 1998, they'll have a negative time of running the mile. And then the host was like, wait, that doesn't seem right. And then he had his instructive moment for little kids watching this math show on PBS of why that's stupid.
Mm-hmm. So here's our instructive moment now, explaining why this won't work with prediction markets. Yeah, that did happen though. I know a lot of people were sort of like, oh, if prediction markets are so smart, how come they failed to predict this outcome? But really all they did was predict some odds. And like, if a prediction market says something is going to happen 70% of the time, then it should fail 30% of the time. That means it was right.
Mm-hmm.
If it fails more or less than 30%, both of those things actually mean that it was wrong. But if it predicts an event's 70% likely to occur and it does or doesn't, you don't actually learn very much.
Right. Not from a single data point.
Yeah. Well, you can. You learn a little, but not enough.
Okay. So the whole idea that prediction markets are based on is this thing called the wisdom of the crowds.
No, it's not. They're not based on that. I'm going to disagree with you there. Because the wisdom of the crowds is like, we take a bunch of people's estimates that cost them nothing to make and then average them together. But the whole thing a prediction market is trying to do is make it so your estimate has something at stake. You have to stake something to make your claim.
But all that does is just reduce the size of the crowd. It takes a subset of the crowd that's willing to bet money. It's still the crowd, though.
But it means if you're really sure, you can stake more.
Okay, and so then you have a weighted average of your opinion, too. I feel like fundamentally it's still the wisdom of the crowds.
I think we disagree on that point. If only there was a way to set up a prediction market about this.
Or just have an instantaneous auction to see which one of us was willing to pay more to be right.
I could just bet that I'm so right. I push you right out of the market.
I'm always willing to bet $1,000 that I'm right on anything. I'll just set that.
You'll be like, too rich for my blood.
And then I'll just make sure that I don't put my ass on the line for anything I'm not that sure of.
There you go. I feel like we're not using prediction markets correctly here in these examples.
Yeah, that's not how a prediction market works. That's a different thing.
So, in general, what I've always seen as far as why a prediction market is strong is because if it says something is going to happen at 70% odds and you say, no, it's not, if you're really sure, then you can stake some money to say that that outcome is not 70%. And if you're right, well, first off, if you're wrong, it'll still put more money into the market and it'll move it in one direction or the other. But also, if you're right, in general, you move the market more towards being accurate. And so you say like, well, okay, well, what if a bunch of idiots get into these markets and they're always like, what if there's someone who has the flippest philosophy where every decision that they make is guided by the flip of a coin? And they'll look at all the prediction markets and say, these are all way off of 50%, which is the only true outcome. So I'm going to always bid on these contracts to push them more towards 50%. So you get a flippist on the prediction market who has millions of dollars. And I mean, intuitively, we all know this guy is wrong. Everything isn't a 50% chance of occurring. And so what'll happen is he will inject more money into the market that people who have more knowledge will take from him. And so if this guy keeps trying to push everything towards 50%, and like, I don't know, a simple one would be a weather example. Like, what's the chance of it raining? In general, most places on Earth, I think it's likelier that it's not going to rain. And so people are going to go around selling contracts to this guy for 50 cents like crazy because they're going to be like, there's no way that the 50% is the true odds. And eventually they're going to take all of his money and he's going to be forced to exit the market. Or perhaps he has an unlimited supply of money and he'll keep pumping money into the market. But one of the things that a prediction market does is allocates money to predictors who are best at predicting. And so that's one of the things that makes it so good at predicting. And if you think that you have the ability to outpredict prediction markets, then you can move into a prediction market and make a bunch of money if you're right. You're probably not, but if you are, then you can. And so once in a while, I'll see something like from especially members of the press who misunderstand how prediction markets work, and they act like they are one of many forecasting techniques that people can use. And sometimes they'll commit the fallacy of saying they're not even the most accurate way. Actually, a panel of experts hand selected is more effective. But in general, if this panel was better at doing it, they could go hop on a prediction market and make a ton of money, but they don't. And the prediction market generally will defeat any other type of forecasting technique because any forecasting technique that was better would hop on the prediction market, make a bunch of money, but also in the process of doing so, essentially put their predictions in public view because they would accurately price the contracts at the price that they should be. The only exceptions to this are when you have some kind of really weird secret thing or you have some very illiquid market or something like that. Like if you were to predict what are the odds that the US government secretly has an alien spacecraft in Area 51 like in the movie Independence Day, that prediction market would probably not accurately reflect the odds just about ever.
Is that because there's no way to verify it?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons. And also, yeah, like maybe they'll never announce what the information was. Also, anyone participating in this market is probably not in possession of additional information. Although we'll get into that. I don't know. You could probably also bet on some kind of weird self-referential outcome. Like, what are the odds that this prediction market goes bankrupt without paying anyone out? And that one would not be. I don't think that contract would be priced correctly. But actually, I guess I should just let that be a segue into the next point that I wanted to make, which is a prediction market has this interesting application for people who want to leak information and get compensated for it. So, since you now understand the hypothetical contract that pays out $1 if an event occurs, for events that are publicly verifiable, there are certain classes of events where it might be really hard to get paid for this event. But with a prediction market, it becomes very easy. So in our example, let's say that you're Edward Snowden and you want to get paid for leaking all of your documents. I don't know how all of our listeners necessarily feel about him, but regardless, if you think, oh, I want to get paid for this, I don't want to just leak them for free, you could create a prediction market on a public platform that says, I predict a bunch of documents will get released about NSA secret programs in the next year. And probably a bunch of people will be like, well, I don't think that's going to happen. Or I think it's going to happen, but there's like a 10% chance of that. And you, as Edward Snowden, know that the chance is roughly 100%. because you're going to do it. And so what you can do is just counterparty anyone who's willing to pay anything for these contracts, because obviously you value the contract at $1. And so you buy all the contracts that anyone will offer, and this also like injects a bunch of money into the market and will probably attract some interest for it. And then at that point, it'll start being sort of self-referential, where people see like, hey, this market has a lot of motion. I wonder if there's a leaker behind it. And then people will start pricing it more accurately. But at least initially, you can buy a lot of contracts if you're Snowden. So then you release the documents, and then you get paid. I don't know how the money gets to you. That's a problem you would have to solve. But it does sort of incentivize leaking stuff to the public in this way that's not really incentivized right now.
Yeah. So there's another similar type of market called an assassination market, where you do a similar thing, and you would say, for instance, I think such and such will be assassinated on some date.
JFK. Let's use him as an example.
Yeah. So I guess you could play this several ways. If you were Lee Harvey Oswald and you knew you were going to assassinate JFK on November 2nd, 1963, then you could set this up in the same way that Blake's example with Edward Snowden works.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say you were some other person and you just wanted JFK assassinated. Then you might say, I think JFK would be assassinated in some range of dates or whatever. And then you would start buying positions accordingly to incentivize somebody to kill him within that date. Because you would hope that Lee Harvey Oswald would come on there and say, you know, I'm going to be in Dallas that day and I could do this and make a lot of money. And so it's a way for people to pay an anonymous assassin to kill someone.
Mm-hmm. I've actually thought about that a lot since reading about it, and I don't see a lot of very good ways to prevent that from occurring. I think in general, prediction platforms will not allow people to trade contracts on such a thing, but it gets kind of difficult because people do bet on things like, when is the Pope gonna die? More along the lines of like a sports betting type of outcome. It's like, you know, I bet he's got another 5 years in him. And they're like, I'll take that bet. And like, these people are not wanting him dead at any particular time. They're just betting on the outcome. But then it sort of becomes an assassination market if there's enough money at stake, or it's a like high profile enough target or whatever. And I've seen someone's list of refutations about that. Like, if people set up anonymous decentralized markets like with a blockchain or something like that, they're like, here's why it won't be such a big problem. But most of it amounts to something like, well, if you're targeted, you can fake your own death, and then it'll screw with everyone who's trading contracts. But then that still means that someone can put $1 million at stake betting that you're going to be dead, and then you're sort of forced to fake your own death for the period of time for the contracts to expire, which is, it means someone can pay $1 million to cause a huge disruption to someone else's life. And there are people who can pay $1 million to do that to other people. And so I don't really know if people set up a prediction market that can't really be controlled by a government. I don't know how anyone's really going to do anything about that. I guess they'll have to try and detect people who are receiving a bunch of money from a prediction market for betting on outcomes like this, and then go after them just criminally the regular way. But it could get really difficult.
Yeah, once you had your suspect, you could just perform a parallel construction of a case against them. If your analysis of the prediction market says that Lee Harvey Oswald had huge bets that JFK was going to die on November 2nd, then you would then start investigating him for that crime and eventually probably uncover evidence the legal way and the regular way that linked him to the crime.
Yeah, seems like the likeliest thing. But then it starts getting really difficult with certain things, like if someone bets that a company is going to get hacked, that becomes pretty problematic. And also the people betting on it and doing the hacking and stuff can be in jurisdictions that are hard to do anything about.
Mm-hmm.
So like Russian group bets that an American company is going to get hacked, and then another Russian group hacks them, and then the US is understandably irritated about this, but what are they going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes kind of a problem. So one of the downsides of anonymous decentralized prediction markets, should they ever occur.
Let's talk briefly about a couple of the problems that anonymous decentralization introduces.
Okay.
Specifically, verification of the outcome of the event.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, there are a couple of prediction markets accessible to US citizens that are legal to use. They basically have exemptions from the US government, but they have restrictions on things like how much money you can wager and stuff like that. And so they exist mostly for academic purposes, though you can go on them and make bets and make money if you can out predict other players in the market. And for those markets, you just have some guys who, work for the companies who run these, and they say, hey, Donald Trump won the election. That's the outcome.
Hmm.
And so then they go into their software and they mark that as the outcome, and everybody who held those shares gets paid $1 each. When it's anonymous and decentralized, you have a problem of, how do I trust somebody to verify the outcome? How do I know who is doing this? How are they chosen? How are they going to be incentivized to not fake the outcome and steal a lot of money? So let's say you were in the weeks in between a bunch of football playoffs and the Super Bowl. And so the two teams who are going to play in the Super Bowl were known, and someone sets up a bet on a prediction market between those two teams who's going to win. And it works normally up until the day of the game, and then it's revealed that star quarterback broke his leg and he's not playing. And so the odds of his team winning are now very low. And somebody involved in the prediction market with certifying the result has bet very heavily on his team. He's now highly incentivized to fake the outcome in order to make a bunch of money for himself.
It's not really fake. It's like misreport.
Well, sure.
Everyone will know what the true outcome was.
Sure.
Then he won't step in and make the game go the other way. It's not horse race fixing.
He assassinates the opposing quarterback.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, he just misreports and lies about the outcome.
Right. And so on a decentralized market, that's a problem. How do you solve that problem? And there was this market called Augur that I guess is still not up and running, but it's
I think it exists.
yeah, I think they're still in beta the last time they sent me an email. But they're attempting to be a decentralized, I think anonymous also, prediction market online using blockchain. So the way they proposed to handle it was you would have this separate cryptocurrency that was reputation tokens. And if you held reputation tokens, you could then spend some of them to certify the outcome of an event. And so if you certify the outcome as Team A wins the Super Bowl, and enough other people with reputation tokens certify the same outcome, you get paid back all your reputation tokens plus any reputation tokens of people who certified the wrong outcome. And so it's kind of another level of betting, but it's not so much betting as, are you doing this right? But it's still susceptible to situations where someone with enough reputation could come into the market and override the correct outcome.
Mm-hmm. So the guy who was originally behind Truthcoin, which later morphed into Augur, sort of, but he's still behind Truthcoin and denounces Augur now. Paul Storks, I don't remember how to say his last name. He has talked about this in great detail, and I mean, it is a very hard problem to solve, but he's talked about things like how all of the predictors, or I think judges is the role. I think a person who confirms what an outcome is called a judge. He's talked about how all the judges need to predict all of the outcomes for every event, always. Because otherwise, what you can do is take all your reputation and just show up for one big event and blow all their reputation to try and sway one single outcome. And so essentially the judges have to sit there and they have to do all this work or have their reputation tokens leak away, because that's the thing that gives the reputation tokens value, is if they have to be continuously reused to predict outcomes or else they go away. And so that means that this person's actually reputable. And so then people are like, oh, isn't this really inefficient? Because then you have to predict all the outcomes every time. And he's like, well, it's not that much work. You could just, like, you'd have to predict a few things every couple of weeks. Like a small organization can do it, or one dedicated person. But people don't want to do that work. And then he's shown why you can blow a bunch of reputation to steal the outcome of one bet. I mean, like it works in the real world. Like, say you're a bookie and you do exactly what Craig was describing. You bet a whole bunch of money yourself on the Super Bowl outcome, and then it goes the other way. You can just steal all of your customers' money and then skip town or whatever. And so it's essentially consuming all of your reputation for one big heist. But with anonymous decentralized prediction markets, it would happen regularly all the time. Every once in a while, someone would be like, well, I want to cash out and I don't want to have to deal with this. And so they could just steal a bunch of money from people. And then probably what happened is people would get like better and better at this scheme. And so you'd see bigger and bigger thefts. And then everyone would say, well, something must be done about this. As far as I know, I don't think Augur solves this problem correctly. And we'll see. I should read more about it. It's very complicated, but I believe as part of him denouncing them, it's that they don't solve this problem correctly. And it's a really hard problem to solve, as Craig said. And I don't really think the incentives are there. I don't think people want this prediction market to exist bad enough to solve all these problems and implement it for quite some time. There's only a few people in the world who really seem to care about this and be competent enough to maybe do it.
So what would the problem be with just taxing every bet at some rate and paying the judges with that in order to incentivize them spending the time to certify enough events to maintain their reputation?
That is what's going to happen in Truthcoin, and maybe it works that way in Augur. You earn fees off of the people making their bets. And that was one of the other problems that Augur had, because it was initially, and I believe they still plan to make it an Ethereum traded coin. And that's the problem of parasitic contracts that we talked about previously in a different podcast, where you can see what the outcomes of an Augur market were, and so you can trade on those, but without having to pay the fees. So it's really important that a prediction market take place on a chain where you can't also trade on the outcomes, but without paying fees. So they haven't really solved that problem. I don't think they're going to. I think it's going to reduce the value of their platform a lot.
The blockchain itself needs to be verifiable, but also hidden.
It doesn't need to be hidden. It just needs to not have another way to trade based on predictors. The problem with Ethereum is it lets you run arbitrary code.
Okay.
So your predictions are going to be stored somewhere in the blockchain. And so then arbitrary code can also take actions based on where that's stored. If you were to run your prediction market on, say, Bitcoin, then you wouldn't be able to move money around based on the outcomes of those predictions if they set it up in such a way where you couldn't, basically.
I understand.
It's very technical. It's difficult to explain. We're not going to explain it in a podcast. But anyway, Augur's probably doomed to fail. It'll probably work for a while, but then I think people will be like, what's the point of this? Also, there's not a lot of reason to decentralize a prediction market, as many people have pointed out. What we really need is just very good centralized prediction markets, like ones with very low fees, good liquidity, and a lot of the barrier there is governments. But if you put it on a blockchain, now you have all the problems of a blockchain, plus the problem of obscurity. So I don't think we're going to get super amazing prediction markets anytime soon. It'd be really cool if we did. It'd be really great if you could just bet someone $1 on anything.
Yeah, I keep offering coworkers $1,000 and $10,000 bets on things, and none of them have ever taken me up on it. They're really sure of their opinions until you ask them to put up $10,000.
Maybe you could try and pull them in with like $10 bets.
It seemed like that would have the opposite effect, because like I'm only going to make a bet on something that I have an incredible amount of certainty of happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I waste that instruction on $10 bets, then my coworkers will be wise. And then they won't give in when I'm like, would you like to bet $10,000 this time?
I have a hard time believing that this is how it's going to work. So you're like, your coworker comes up to you and he's like, I think the president's going to declare martial law next month. And you're like, no, he's not. I'll bet you $10 he won't. So then he doesn't. And you win $10. Now that coworker trusts everything you say. He's like, I think Bitcoin's going to crash to zero and you're in the next month. And you're like, no, it's not. And he's like, you know what, Craig, you're probably right, because you took $10 off me once.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right.
Imagine if the world worked that way. I think you could take $10 from them over and over and over. You should try it and report back to us with the results.
That actually does sound like a much better strategy. Maybe I'll have to re-engage with this one coworker I'm thinking of specifically.
Do they listen to the podcast?
No.
You should.
Do you think Dimitri is satisfied?
I hope so. I hope he hops right on to InTrade or Betfair or Predict It, or I'm not sure if I'm remembering all of the platforms.
The Ohio electronic market?
I think that's what Play Money. Maybe.
Oh,
I hope he
okay.
hops on one of those and starts making a bunch of money with real money prediction markets.
How do you think he would bet on the long-term occupation of Crimea?
It would be hard to certify that outcome, wouldn't it?
No, I don't think so. I think you just look at whether or not the Ukrainian government is exerting control over the area or over more than 50% of the area.
How do you define Ukrainian government and how do you define control?
I feel like you're mincing words here, but I don't actually think this is difficult.
I don't think I'm mincing words here.
Because there will come a point in the future, an expiration date of this bet, where you'll either say, yeah, Crimea is not under the control of the Ukrainian government, or it in fact is.
Well,
and I don't feel like this will be a highly disputed point.
I mean, that's literally what it is right now. It's a highly disputed point.
Well, no. It's contested. It's not disputed, though.
Yes, it is.
Right now, the Russians or a Russian puppet state or whatever is in control.
Well, like, for example, if you go to Google Maps and you go look up who controls this area, depending on whether you're in Ukraine or Russia or the rest of the world, you get one of three different results. If you're in Russia, it says Russia. If you're in Ukraine, it says Ukraine. And if you're in the rest of the world, it says disputed. So, like, that's a good example. And depending on who is certifying this outcome, obviously they're going to go one way or the other. But, I mean, that's one of the problems you run into with governments in disputed territory. Is you have these two people, or two entities, both claiming, I have sole legitimate authority over this. And they'll literally fight tooth and nail to maintain that claim until they think that there's no more chance of them holding it. And so it would be easy to have a prediction market or like a contract for this where it is still disputed at the time the contract expires, and there's not really going to be a way to say definitively one way or another who controls it.
I feel like with territorial disputes, though, you have one group of people who physically controls the land. Like Taiwan, it's the Republic of Taiwan. It's not China.
Well,
the government of the Republic of Taiwan physically controls the land of Taiwan, even though China disputes that Taiwan even exists as a sovereign entity.
Yeah, China doesn't even really dispute it. They're just like, it doesn't. Like, they never refer to it as a sovereign entity.
Sure.
But, yeah, so, like, how would you certify that one way or another?
Who physically controls the land?
Who gets to decide this?
If I go walking over there, am I going to run into a bunch of Ukrainians who are loyal to, is it Kiev?
Yes.
Or am I going to run into a bunch of people who are loyal to Russia?
I don't know.
The people with guns.
But like here's an example of how this would be a huge problem. You go over there and you're like, I don't know, what could you do? You commit some crime and you're like, I want to get arrested. And so then you get arrested. And then you're like, all right, arresting police officers. Are you Russian or Ukrainian? And they're like, we're Crimean. Now what? I mean, this is similar to a question like, who controls Palestine or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if you set your prediction far enough in the future, you could get some kind of resolution on it. Probably in 50 years, Crimea will be clearly controlled by a nation state. Or at some, maybe what you could do is set 5-year increments and say, at this 5-year increment, is it definitively controlled? And probably in some window of time, it'll be definitively controlled by one country.
To some level of certainty.
Yeah. Like right now, I don't think anyone questions Hawaii, for instance. Maybe it was questioned in the past. Maybe it'll be questioned in the future, but it's pretty unambiguous right now. Maybe there's some guy.
Yeah.
There's some guy in Hawaii in a trailer, and he's like, this is the embassy of the Free State of Hawaii, which is its own nation. And we just won't ask that guy.
You know, I actually wanted to suggest that we do a podcast on micronations.
Oh, I thought you were going to say about the guy who claimed that he was the, was it president of the Republic of Texas?
Oh, no, I've never heard of that guy.
Oh, yeah. So for people who are interested in minutia of early American history, Texas was illegally annexed. It was never annexed according to the US government's official annexation policy. They were just like, well, you're annexed. And I think the problem was it didn't have the quorum of votes that's needed by the state's legislature for the state to allow itself to be annexed. It just sort of got annexed on paper. And so now Texas is obviously irrevocably part of the United States. But because the US never did the like procedural thing to add it, this guy realized there was this legal loophole there and was like, I can exploit this. I'm the president of the Republic of Texas, which is its own separate nation. And of course, both the Texas government and the US government took a really dim view of this. And since that guy didn't have a large army and a bunch of missiles and tanks and stuff, his claim was rejected, I guess you could say. But for a while, he was trying to do that. And I remember learning about this in school. I remember learning, like, here's how a state gets annexed. And then they're like, here's what happened in early Texas history, because in Texas, you're taught Texas history. And I remember thinking, like, hey, this doesn't line up exactly. And it's true, it doesn't, but it doesn't really matter. So I thought you were going to bring that guy up.
No, I was thinking of the sea land guy south of Britain. And then also there's a dude in Australia who's actually gone way further. He got the Australian government to recognize him at one point. Like they wrote some official from the local government wrote him a letter and like in the letter acknowledged him as the president of this country, which is basically just his sheep farm.
Mm-hmm.
Then he kind of held that letter up as, oh, I've received official recognition of my sovereignty from the Australian government.
Is it still working?
I read about him on Wikipedia and some other places several years ago. I don't know what's happened since, but I feel like they just kind of took the view that this is some crazy old guy on his farm and we'll just leave him alone to his fantasies.
If you want to research micronations for us and tell us all about it, something I'd be really interested in you talking about, it's not exactly a micronation, is what is the status of an Indian reservation in the United States? I have no idea. I've always wondered, to what degree are those sort of their own countries? And to what degree are they federal or state land? Like, who polices them? How do laws apply?
They have their own police forces.
Do they have to?
I don't know if they have to. I think they all do because it's advantageous or they feel like they would rather be policed by themselves than the state government.
Do they pay federal and state income tax?
I bet that would vary tribe to tribe depending on the specific treaties with them. Because you know they're exempt from things like gambling laws. That's why they have all the casinos, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And or at least if you're in a state where gambling is not normally legal like Texas. So for us in Texas, we have no legal casinos here. But I can drive north of the DFW Metroplex for like an hour and a half, cross the border into Oklahoma, and literally within about 4 minutes be at a casino once I cross the border.
Mm.
But they also just tend to have a bunch of casinos because in states where gambling is not legal, they can still have casinos on their reservations. Now, they're also exempt from things like cigarette taxes, and that's why you end up with all these crimes where people will buy truckloads of cigarettes from Indian reservations and then smuggle them into places that do have cigarette taxes and resell them tax-free. So I feel like there's probably going to be this odd mismatch of like, or mashup rather, of laws that they're subject to and laws that they're not. And it'll probably just come down to how good they were at negotiating their treaties with the US federal government.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know how that works. While you're doing all of your other research with Sealand and other micronations.
I think there are only a couple of interesting micronations out there. There's Sealand and there's the guy in Australia. And I guess you could probably talk about the seasteader movement, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. But I think next podcast you're going to talk about firearms forensic science.
Yes. The science of forensics of guns and bullets and explosives and things like that.
That should be cool.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited. It's interesting because it intersects with law and then it intersects with politics a lot, and you wouldn't think that at first. But also it's several intersecting subjects that I've read about for many years just as a gun enthusiast. And then I thought I actually started binge watching Forensic Files on Netflix, like probably 100 episodes so far. And then a lot of those cases come down to like firearm forensic science, which got me more interested in it.
I would also note that it intersects with both engineering and fun.
Ah, yes. And, you know, you could present it on a podcast that mostly focuses on weapons.
That's all we're about. So tune in next week for yet another podcast about guns and stuff.